EP as country porch listening music, and the album as cliff diving music.
I mean, Julia's pretty musically chill, though.
Could be.
Oh, there it is. Just unplug it, plug it back in.
Julia could easily be a soft song on their album.
True.
I think it. Yeah, that's the point.
All right. Let me send out Z-Link. Don't you think it's time? Don't you think it's time?
With Barney headphones.
They're plugged in right there for you.
Beautiful, thank you. Ryan's not on there, is he?
Yeah, he's on Skype.
You there?
I haven't connected him yet.
Okay.
He is aware of us being here.
Let me know. We should talk about
Oh, what?
RPGs. Like how different RPGs use time. And that's kind of a...
RPGs are interesting because they're really straightforward randomness.
Yeah.
I mean, all the ones I'm aware of, at least, are incredibly straightforward, and it's just what probability curve do we want to give to this thing, and then we chart that with dice. Which is fine, because it's not a strategy game. Don't you think it's time?
In terms of game design, though, like it's a pretty distilled thought exercise of designing a randomness.
Yeah, although I suspect RPGs that I'm not aware of, maybe I've played with that a bit more. I open my notes. Oh, Amber, were you going to do this one? That's all right. You want to get some gas while you're at it? $0. Sorry, every time I've driven the car since then, the gas station's been closed. Yes. In fact, it has already started. You're live. What? I didn't know you were going to use the car. I was just going to do it tomorrow. What a boss. I could never do that. Getting gas in her pajamas.
Nice.
This is the melody is like the main, like what he's singing, right?
Yeah.
This is the melody that gets stuck in my head every time I listen to the album.
Yeah. Yeah.
What if we'll get anyone? Any of the West Coast people? I don't think we'll be East Coasters. Connecting now. Yo, yo. You hear me? I haven't heard anything from your end yet.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. There we go.
Hello? There you go. Better now?
Yes. Go ahead and say something again.
Right. Something again.
1 sec.
I'm on a train going up the coast. We just passed the port of Everett. We're right along the water, and it's really cool.
I'm gonna bump you up just a hair.
I'm looking forward to your random drops and reconnections. I think that'll be real feedback.
Yeah. I'm on my phone, so hopefully it'll switch back and forth if the Wi-Fi drops. But
Cool. You sound good now.
yeah.
There we go. That's a bit better. Okay. Should be
I'm
okay.
trying not to talk too loud because I'm, in the compartment with people. So
Yeah. I just bumped it on Skype there.
cool.
Alrighty. You said you have till midnight?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's get it going then.
Alexa, pause.
Yeah, turn off the music. Alright, ritual silence time. Alrighty. I think this will be an interesting one. We will see. Actually, let's try to... Does that do...
It's a good thing we ended on that song.
I don't know.
So that we can have it extra stuck in our heads.
Yeah. Make sure you're getting close to the mic.
Yeah? Is that good?
Oh, wait a minute. Why am I getting picked up?
You've got nothing in front of you.
No. I'm getting picked up on your channel. Come on. Test. Why is that? There's always something. Test. It's still doing it. Yeah, I think the internal mic is picking it up. Now we got 2 people watching. One of them is Matt. Great. Recording. Test. Wait, what? Why is the webcam mic on? Test. Oh, that didn't do it. Come on. Test. HD audio, that's correct. Test. Still doing it. What the heck? Alright, I'm gonna unplug and plug it back in. See if that works. Test. What the heck? Why? Test. Tap on yours, man?
Yeah.
No. That's not right.
Is that the coast? Yeah. My cats are cookies. Oh, really? Yeah. It's too big. Yeah.
Test. It's still picking me up. Sorry, Joshua. Something weird's going on with the sound. Test. Test. Move to input 3 and see if that does anything. Test. No, that didn't change anything. Tap on yours? Yeah, I think I might have plugged the wrong thing in. Hold on. This is... How can I plug the wrong thing? I just did this. What's this one? This one goes to... that. Let's try this. Why am I just making a horrible noise now? Unplug this. Do that. It's like it's not recognizing the cord input because it's defaulting to the internal laptop mic. No. Test. No. Test. Test. What if I disabled that.
Test. Test. Oops, that's the wrong one.
Test. It's plugged in. If I plug it directly. It didn't like that. Oh. That looks different. Nope. If I do this.
Test. Oh, hey. Hold on. Come on. Test. Test. God, those are tons of static. Sorry.
Come on. I must need a new one of these splitters. Or it's the freaking laptop.
Test, test. Tap on yours, Mike. Right. We're getting one ear.
Does
Great.
that matter?
I mean, kinda. It's only
Is that
recording the
input
left
or
channel.
output randomness?
I don't know which randomness this is. Weird ASMR. ASMR, yeah. Alright, so we've got the where close. Oh?
I sound great.
Oh, it sounds amazing. Yes! Alright, I'm very sorry, everyone. I'm gonna actually buy a new one of these in case it is in fact that. This seems like it's that cord.
Did we lose Orion? Are you still around, Do?
I still haven't connected.
There, I think I'm back.
Yeah, you're back. Alrighty.
Okay, I had muted my mic.
Sorry about everyone. We can actually start now. Okay. New moment of silence. Welcome to the Thoughtful Gamer Podcast, episode 38. As always, I'm Mark. Here with me today is Matt.
Didn't you say 28 on the sheet? I wasn't prepared for 38.
It's 38.
38, okay. Your Google Doc says 28. Off to a great start, Mark.
It's fine. Everyone knows how pristine my plans are. And then we've got all the way on a train, literally on a train, Orion is here with us also.
Hello. By the magic of the internet.
Frankly, it sounds way better with you on the train than when you were in Scotland. Not
Absolutely.
movie.
Well,
You're not in it.
I also have a better headset.
Okay.
Which
Oh,
helps.
that's true, yeah.
You're not in a bar or pub.
Yeah, there's no one doing dishes.
Yeah. Also that.
Yeah. And today we are here to talk about randomness. Behind the scenes, I think we've had the most debate and discussion we've ever had.
It got heated.
Podcast.
Got real
It
heated.
got real heated. I got perturbed.
I was
about-
perturbed.
There's mutual perturbedness.
Perturbation.
Perturbation.
Perturbation? Is that
Is
a
that
word?
actually a word?
Perturbation. Perturbation is probably, if I had to guess.
It
But
sounds very similar to trepidation. But it doesn't.
But
mean-
anyway, we had great conversation from the...
No, it was good. I was only heated because I cared it so much and found it interesting.
Yeah, that's why I like arguing with you guys.
Yeah.
Because we care.
We have great arguments.
We do.
It's very nice. Anyways.
It's more fun arguing with you guys than my fiance.
Oh, man. You're pretty confident she's not listening to this.
Well, I am, for one. I mean, there are many other forms of talking that I would choose to participate with her over you.
I mean,
But arguing specifically.
My Amber and I get in. I mean, yeah, they're arguments, but we love it. It's like a form of recreation for us. And I remember distinctly, like, I don't know if it was you, Matt, or you, Orion. I know Wes at one point got really concerned because
You guys sound really upset. Like, you sound like you're getting really upset. And I have learned that you will never stay mad at each other, so it doesn't bother me as much as it maybe used to. But in the moment, you guys are intensely arguing, and it sounds like you're really annoyed at the other person of like, why can't you understand this? This is the most obvious thing ever.
Yeah, it's a weird state to be in. We just kind of follow into it, and we both enjoy it.
Yeah.
Mostly.
Yeah, I mean,
there have been a couple times where we had to like call it off mid-argument about something. And it's usually about something philosophical or kind of head in the clouds.
Yeah.
But
Well, you're kind of head in the clouds and Amber's more practical, right?
yeah, generally.
It's the same with me and my Amber.
Yeah.
But your Amber's a lawyer, so...
Yes. Trained in argumentation.
My
As am I.
My Amber works in medicine because she likes to care for people,
Yes.
not argue with them.
It's fair. Anyways, all of that to say
That was, yeah.
we never actually resolved really our argument. I kind of understand what you are talking about more.
We got to the point where we can argue about it now,
Yes.
and that's where we wanted to get.
Yeah, we'll get to that, though. But we're talking about randomness and uncertainty. Mostly randomness. We'll stick with that, I think, because uncertainty is such a broad topic. But we've been wanting to do this podcast for a while, I know. And I wanted to get through Greg Kostakayan's Uncertainty in Games book, which I gave a glowing review to on the website first. And I wanted to have some time to prepare and brainstorm for this one because I think the topic's super interesting. And the book's really great, but I think we're going to not go as broad as that book. We're going to stick with randomness as however we define that, which I guess is the first part of what we need to do is...
I mean, apparently we don't agree on that.
Yeah, we don't really... I don't know. here's the thing.
There's a lot of uncertainty.
I feel like I intuitively understand the difference between randomness and uncertainty. But when I tried to come down and like define it, of like how do I distinguish these terms? Because I think there's some overlap. The best thing I came up with was agency, but that seemed kind of weak. So
Yeah, Orion.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk a bit about Kostakayan's book first, and then we'll get into defining things. And Matt and I came to a very bizarre way of delineating randomness and uncertainty.
Basically, to exclude all the things I want to talk about. No,
No.
That's not true.
That doesn't seem like it works. It seems like a very sloppy way of defining things. But I really like the way Kostakayan framed everything, where he's like, okay, we're going to talk about uncertainty and how it's a key component in games, and randomness is a part of that. So it's under the subset of uncertainty, which I think is kind of colloquially how gamers understand those words. And through my discussions with Matt, I'm more convinced that it's not that clear. But I think it works kind of in conversation. So the types of uncertainty that Kostakayan talks about are like uncertainty of what your opponents are going to do, uncertainty of like analytic uncertainty of just the immense puzzle in front of you, uncertainty of your own skills. So in a dexterity game or most video games, you have the kind of, I think he calls it performative uncertainty, along with other things. But randomness is just one part of that, or chance. So I kind of like that, but it's very, very hard to pin down anything coherent in defining those terms. I think it's helpful when we're talking in a games context, you know, loose, not like strict like game theory or whatever, which may be different, or something really technical with programming or logic, but in just a board games context, I think it's helpful to have randomness be one part of the set of uncertainty.
Yeah. Hey, Orion, we're getting a lot of
really?
background.
It wasn't horrible.
Josh, what do you think?
I can make use of the mute button.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd probably be good.
So when we get to trying to distinguish that, and if that's our goal because we think that's kind of a useful way to frame randomness, it's like Orion was saying, it's something where it's like, I know it when I see it, but then when you think about it further, it kind of breaks down. So it's like, okay, what if it's outside? What if it's just uncertain things outside the player's agency? And then you get to questions of whose players' agencies, and ultimately, well, I'm just going to say ultimately it devolves into metaphysical questions about the nature of reality, but we're going to not talk about that, but just recognize that ultimately...
Yeah, did you mention whose agency? Because I know that came up in our discussion earlier.
Right, because it's a really subjective thing, randomness. Like...
Yeah, it's easy to point to like flipping a coin and say that is random.
Right. But if you think about it, if someone flips a coin, sees the result, and hides it, to the person who's guessing it's a random result, but to the person who's seen the result already, it has ceased to be random, even though it's the same moment in time and the same physical object.
Yeah, not that I have an answer at this moment, but at some point, I mean, we're talking about randomness as it pertains to playing a game or maybe designing a game. And so
right.
I mean,
and so,
I mean, it's almost like any strict definition might break down in this conversation.
Sure. Well, then you can say, okay, well, things that another player is determining or actions they're taking aren't random because it's a person determining that. But from the perspective of an opponent, it can feel random, and then you threw, of course, the AI example. What if the opponent was an AI? Does it then become random, even if even if you're looking at a scenario where the same move was made or something like that?
And does it matter if it's a deterministic AI or not?
Yeah, which, I mean, that was the point of our pre-discussion where I'm like, I don't have a good answer for this, but I also don't care as much. Like, that's an interesting discussion, but maybe not an interesting one for this particular podcast. So, Ryan, here's something that I came up with on the spot earlier, and it sounds really dumb, but I think it might work. Something is uncertain if you can't predict it with certainty, right? As the agent, as the observer, from your perspective, if there's doubt as to what is going to happen, that's uncertain. Easy enough. Randomness is, and again, this is something I've just spitballed and came up with, but randomness is something that the collective knowledge of the players can't predict, of every participant in the game together.
Oh, I think that's
so basically if everyone played face up or hands up or whatever, sort of.
Or if you can imagine another party that had the collective knowledge of all those people, for
so if,
like an easy
example. If it's like the iRobot short story with the robot that can read people's minds and tries to make them happy. So if you had that robot,
it's too late to be going.
Robot could also not determine the answer or the result.
Right. So the point is that removes things like opponent uncertainty from randomness, but keeps things like flipping a card over from a deck in the category of random.
Right.
I haven't thought of something where it
enough,
breaks it down. I feel like it'll break down at some point, but that might be an interesting way to draw the line. Even again, it seems very clumsy.
It's incredibly clumsy, and I think it would break down very quickly as well.
But I don't know where it breaks down.
I mean,
that's the problem.
The thing I wanted to talk about breaks it.
Well, we'll get to that in a bit, Matt.
And that's not my... I don't need to get to that. I'm letting you drive this conversation.
But just as a tidbit, I know you guys know more about this than I do, and this is going back to the more kind of metaphysical discussion, but I think it's really interesting, is that I didn't realize until I saw, I believe, a number file video on it. That's a great YouTube channel that I keep up with, about how computers generate random numbers. And that, in computer science, that's actually a very difficult problem that people have been trying to figure out. And there are a handful of different ways they do it. I don't remember what the kind of common way is that most computers would do it now. Are you guys aware?
I forget what the big thing in Orion, maybe you know this more precisely, is by basically doing large modulo division using prime numbers. I think like you can make a simple random number generator by like multiplying by something and then taking the modulo 17 over and over again. And if you do that in a certain way, you can generate bits that you get pseudo random numbers. I think like a simple implementation might just do just that.
Interesting.
Orion, in your computer science knowledge, are you aware of any more specifics?
The most common way I've seen, there's two that I'm most aware of. One, back when I was in school, in our C++ programming, there was basically a giant number circle that was randomly distributed, but if you just called getRand or whatever the function was, it would give you the same number every time unless you gave it a seed. So the seed is basically choosing a unpredictable spot around the number circle to start walking from, and in that sense you're generating random numbers because you couldn't reproduce it without knowing the seed.
What would the seed
But obviously that's a
Well,
that's
it
a
could be
clumsy way.
anything. I mean, if you've played Minecraft, when you generate a new world, you can type in a seed. All that is a string that gets converted to bits, and then
It's basically
it's-
a fancy way of doing an offset.
yeah, and then basically
But
that,
it's like, is it like a number you input?
yeah.
Okay.
It breaks down to
So-
being a
so it
number.
breaks
It's part of
down
like
in-
configuration. Like the most common way we did is just grab the time in milliseconds or something and use that as our seed, so that if you
Okay.
ran it again 2 seconds from now, you'd get a completely different
Yeah,
set
but-
of numbers.
Yeah, so you have
I mean,
to find
the-
some way to try to...
The point is, it's a relatively simple mathematical operation involving, numbers that are big enough that you wouldn't want to do it by hand, primey numbers.
Right.
But
for a computer, it's arithmetic and trivial.
yeah, and then you're
the
just doing the
question-
same thing over and over again, spitting out a random sequence, pseudo-random sequence.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
The obvious thing is that it, by very strict definitions, it can never be actually random, but it's random enough that it doesn't really matter for practical purposes.
Yeah, I mean, and
Right.
this is a whole. We could go on tangents so far.
Yeah, I just want to
But,
dip our toes in
like,
this one.
it's a real problem for certain situations, like cryptography. So, like when you get into the security world, it's not enough to just use a built-in random number generator or stuff like that. There are whole parts of computer science and mathematics that break down to, like, if we can solve this problem that we don't know that we can solve, it will make all computer basically it would basically make all network traffic on the internet inherently unsecure
Interesting.
based on can we solve these, because yeah, I don't know Ryan, is that directly related to randomness, or is that kind of tangential? I'm kind of a little
I
bit.
think it's tangential. I mean,
Yeah.
the kind of the point where it touches is that true randomness is extremely difficult to find,
Yeah.
because basically everywhere you look is based on some pattern if you drill far enough down.
Yeah.
And if you
Yeah.
can find that pattern or solve the mathematical equation, then you can predict the next number, which means it's not a random sequence.
Yeah, and where that point just completely blew past me. Never mind.
I think I remember in the number file video, the guy who was explaining this had a few different ways he built up of generating random numbers, and one of them had to do with the decay of a certain isotope.
Yeah,
And you'd pick one of the decimal points of whatever was reading the decay of
sure.
that thing, and that was like his favorite way of doing it.
I mean, there
Joshua-
you're using quantum physics,
Yeah.
which in our
Is it's
metaphysical sense, you might say is a more true random than anything that you could do in a Newtonian world.
Sure. We're not going to get into that one. I don't want to go into anything that's dealing with quantum. Joshua in the chat pointed out that there's some place, he says there's some place that takes a picture of fish in fish tanks to randomly generate seed keys for encryption. That is an ingenious way of randomly generating
Yeah.
a seed
Yeah.
key.
Yeah.
Something to do with fish swimming around, or you could anything with like fluid dynamics would be pretty
Yeah, or
random,
just
right?
noise. I mean,
Yeah.
all a picture is essentially noise.
Yeah.
So like, you can imagine a system that like takes a barometric reading. You could have just a simple thing inside of your computer that takes the air pressure and uses that to seed
Yeah.
randomness.
Yeah.
This
It's
is so
interesting.
relevant to board games.
Well, I was going to pull this back. Watch this. So you have a level of randomness that's important for things like computer security. Pulling back, you have randomness through something like dice, where in Vegas they have to have dice with straight, hard-cornered edges, because if you had kind of rounded edges, it can be fiddled with easier, or it can roll less true. And then in board games, we just go with whatever they give us in the box. And we're fine with it. And we don't even shuffle our decks of cards 7 times to get like the 99 point whatever degree of randomness that gives you. Sometimes you only shuffle it like 3 or 4 times. We're okay with that. So that is the realm we're going to be talking about randomness in, with our non-riffle shuffles and really, really rounded dice. I think Memoir 44 is the worst for those rounded dice. Those are like spheres.
Nearly
and
spheres.
They're like light wood. Like, I like that game, but man, those dice... Those are the only dice I think I've gotten where I feel like they're not true. Because, I don't know, just the combination of how those were made. I wish they were better. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, now that we've gotten all the weird philosophical stuff out of the way, is something that's really pertinent to board gaming, and that is input and output randomness, which is a phrase coined by Jeff Engelstein in Ludology, the Ludology podcast. And the idea is that you can have randomness on either side of the player's decision point. So you can have randomness that gives the player the context for their decision, what we call input randomness, and then you can give players, you can have players make a decision and then randomly determine some or all of the outcome of that decision. So, in a traditional kind of dice chucking dungeon crawler, you decide to attack something, or in an RPG, you decide to attack something, and then you roll the die, and that determines whether or not you hit, or how much damage you what's the verb I'm looking for?
Inflict.
How much damage you apply to the monster. That's output randomness. Input randomness is something like a dice drafting game, like Castles of Burgundy. You roll the dice first, you see what the dice are, and then you make your decisions based on the constraints that randomness gives you.
Did we lose though, or did we gain
Lost
him?
him. You said rip. You back?
Yes. Can you hear me?
There you are. Yep. What did you drop?
Okay, cool.
We're on input and output randomness.
I heard you bringing it back. I heard you bringing it back down to the level of acceptable randomness for board games, and you said how we shuffled enough times, and that was about the last thing I heard.
Okay.
We've just been talking about in-out random.
I just gave an overview of input and output randomness. So that's where we're at.
Okay, and by that you just mean pre and post decision?
Yeah.
And input is pre-decision?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we should say that
Okay.
I typically call this pre-decision and post-decision randomness, which I think is more descriptive, but input,
it sounds
output...
less cool.
I frankly don't know if I agree with that, but I'm okay with input, output randomness. That's also... because it's still about the decision, so...
Yeah. And typically from kind of a Eurogamer point of view, you would prefer input randomness. And I think we would all agree with that. I mean, we certainly enjoy games that have output randomness. Like, we all enjoy Twilight Imperium, and that has a substantial amount of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the discussion about what's okay or how games use randomness well or poorly, I think a lot of that discussion revolves around the output randomness.
Yes.
Input randomness is... It's hard to find a situation where that's a bad thing. And I think in most... Yeah, like, I think Castles of Burgundy is an excellent example. What makes Castles of Burgundy different one time to the next time? It's that every round starts with a slightly different set of kind of randomized parameters that kick off all the decisions.
Well, it has also 2 layers. You have the set of tokens that are available that round.
Right.
And then each turn you have your dice that are rolled that provide some input randomness. And the idea with input randomness is that it just makes the decisions more impactful. Because
impactful.
Or at least feel more impactful. I think it feels like you have more control over things.
Well, it feels like you have more control over things. I don't know if the way you phrased it I would agree with. It makes the decision more interesting because you're not making the same decision over and over again every time you play. It makes the decisions more interesting because you're...
Oh, in terms of variability, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, as far as variability in a heavy Euro game, it's usually completely input randomness.
Yeah, I think that's what people strive towards.
Yeah.
I think the impact thing still stands because when you have only input randomness, you can follow a direct line between the causal nature of your action and the result of that. Whereas when you have output randomness, you get the situation which is psychologically troubling where you can effectively lose a turn or lose an action or waste some time or lose something that you thought you would gain or lose something that you had.
Yeah, sorry. In the direct comparison between the two, I think you're right. It makes it feel more directly impactful because when you make the decision, you've 100% gotten the result.
Yes.
Because the randomness happened before you made the decision.
Yeah. But I mean, I think some example, and again, I think in a very generalized sense, I would agree with most people that input randomness is to be preferred. But we can see some really interesting cases where games employ both. And Dominion was the example that I think came to everyone's mind when we were planning for this because it has elements of both input and output randomness. There's more input because you're drawing your hand of cards, and that's your input randomness, and you have things to do with. But you can play cards to draw additional cards during your turn. The timing of how you play cards out can have an effect on that, and you can take different risks based on what cards you think you're going to draw. It's not as significant as many output randomness situations, but it is there.
See, I don't know if I would choose Dominion as an example for input-output randomness, because most of Dominion is, or a lot of Dominion is output randomness.
How so?
No, I guess it depends. It depends so much on the strategy. Sorry, I was just thinking of like a chaining deck.
It depends on how your perspective also, right?
But
because No, never mind. My point failed in my mind. Go ahead.
So, I mean, the really interesting thing about Dominion's randomness is that deck management, I think. And you're building a deck, and you have complete control over what goes into your deck. Unless you're playing with curses or whatever. But you mostly have complete control over what goes into your deck. But what you don't have control over is exactly which 5 cards you draw. So, in a sense, that's your input randomness. But on a macro scale, you kind of do have control.
Right, yeah. It's certainly controlled randomness. Like it's you could call it a type of bounded randomness you are affecting directly.
Sorry, so I guess I'm just getting muddled as our example. So what's the input randomness?
The cards you draw.
The cards you draw. And the output randomness is really it's only like if you're drawing other cards.
That's the main way, I think.
Yeah.
There's some other effects, some attacks that have output randomness involved.
Yeah.
Where opponents flip a card and maybe you can steal one of them, those kinds of cards.
Well, yeah.
I think I'll just throw something out here and say that in general, some amount of bounded allows, and I think that makes a lot of games more interesting. Sure. How well can you hear me right now?
That's good. You're good now.
I think generally, some amount of bounded output randomness makes a game better because it allows for skillful play. It forces you into a situation where there is some uncertainty and you are forced to weigh your options, and try to make the best play. And sometimes it won't work out. But I think that makes it more interesting than purely the opposite. Or, purely either way. If it's purely deterministic from the point where you draw your hand, or completely random where literally anything could happen, at that point your decision becomes meaningless. And I think, maybe this is becoming less interesting as I go on. But
yeah, so one thing that you said that I liked is the idea of bounding the randomness, right? And I mean, as a game design principle, that's kind of the important thing is how do you want to bound the randomness to give the players a certain experience?
Yeah, and when you're adding output randomness to a game, what you're effectively doing is sacrificing some level of strategy for excitement, right? And suspense.
That's not completely true, but I see what you're saying.
What do you mean by that? The strategy becomes
so you
less...
you can control what kind of randomness. Sorry, you can control the distribution of the randomness.
Oh, sure.
Over time. So while you're right in rolling a die in one scenario, in one situation does what you said. It sacrifices strategy for excitement. But if you're going to do that 10 times over the course of the game, then you have a much better idea of what the results are going to be. You as a player understand. So,
or if you allow things like stacking dice modifiers.
Oh yeah, no.
But from
I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But a perfect information non-random game.
Okay.
Compared to
dice to different actions or things like that.
Yeah, sorry. For some reason, Orion, your thing keeps it's cutting out a bit. Let me start over the sentence. Compared to a perfect information zero randomness game, if you add a little bit of output randomness, that is on the margin going to have a little bit less skill involved in the outcome. Which in most cases I would argue is a good thing. I typically don't like non-random, purely strategic games as much as I like games with some randomness. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that is the trade-off that's happening. Now, obviously, there are great ways to give the players agency in bounding that randomness, and I think risk assessment type decisions that you get with randomness, and it could even be input randomness in phases of the game, right? Because you could have a randomized setup at the beginning, and the game play out more or less zero randomness after that. Or like Castles of Burgundy, you can have different tiers of resetting that input randomness, which then becomes kind of its own. I guess you're not determining. You're still doing the risk assessment type decisions that you would have with a game in which you roll dice to determine some measure of the outcome.
Right.
And so the strategy is not as intense, and it also shifts into kind of this risk assessment framework, which personally I love.
That you keep saying that the strategy is not as intense. I don't know that I agree with that. The strategy shifts to a more risk management framework. That's definitely true.
By intense, I mean that the better player will win on average less.
Sure.
But
that's
but
not
I
a matter of the
completely-
strategy. That's just a matter of the random distribution.
That's what I mean by having not quite as
Yeah. Okay.
not quite as much strategy.
I don't like that phrasing, but I
But
see
you
what you're
understand what
saying.
you mean. Yeah,
I see what
it
you're
is
saying.
poor phrasing there.
Yeah.
So, like, the obvious example, if you go way to one end, is like chess or Go, which, no randomness, purely deterministic, purely skill-based, where that skill is calculating possible moves and evaluating them.
Right. So I'm saying if you add a little bit of randomness to that framework, you're sacrificing some of that skill dependency on the outcome, and you're adding some measure of randomness dependency on the outcome. To varying degrees, obviously.
Yeah. I mean,
you enter a basically a linear scale.
So one game that we occasionally compare to chess is Twilight Struggle, right? Twilight Struggle has a fair number of random things in it.
Oh, a healthy number, yeah.
But I don't think you would say that the strategy is greatly sorry, I'm looking for a certain word. You wouldn't say that the strategy is greatly stymied by the fact that there are random elements, because the framework of risk management or the framework of some of the things are random but will add up to a certain thing by the end of the game. It's all about managing that, and in no way does that limit the strategy.
It limits it a bit, right? So a chess grandmaster is going to beat me at chess 99.99 whatever percent of the time. Whatever the equivalent is of a Twilight Struggle grandmaster will beat me maybe 98% of the time. Like, I don't think there's still a ton of skill in Twilight Struggle. I'm just saying, in a very abstract sense, when you add randomness, you're taking away some measure of the skill dependency on the outcome.
I mean, one way to think of it, and maybe this is how I'm thinking of it, is if you played a Twilight Struggle Grandmaster 100 times or 1,000 times or an infinite number of times, like, he's going to beat you.
But I would get more wins in than in the chess comparison.
Yeah.
That's all I'm
based
saying.
on the random. Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
And Twilight Struggle is a great example because it does have a healthy amount of randomness, which generates a lot of intrigue and excitement and variability and all kinds of good, interesting stuff that we translate as fun. And yet it's still highly skill dependent at the same time. So
I feel like
both.
you're shorting it. Like, it's a brutal 1v1 strategic experience where, I mean, it's not chess, but it's as close to that as modern board gaming gets.
No way.
Uh,
I think it's healthily on that side, but it's not as close as it gets. There's a good amount of luck in Twilight Struggle.
Okay, well, I've only played it a couple times.
Oh, we got the kitty. Look at that fuzzy belly. Oh, she loves this. You're letting us pet your belly
I get
now.
what you're saying, Mark. I get what you're saying, Mark, but I don't like the implication that randomness decreases skill. It's just that the outcome is less deterministic.
Yes.
Because I think risk assessment and probabilistic analysis is a skill in and of itself. And so to take it to kind of the other end, something like poker, which basically everything that happens in the game is random other than your betting. But there's a huge amount of skill in poker in understanding the probabilities and not necessarily counting cards, but knowing the possible outcomes and weighing probabilities and reading people and all of that can also just as easily be called skill, although it's certainly something different than a chess grandmaster.
I think we all agree here. My point is that in a vacuum, that trade-off exists.
Okay.
But I think we can all agree that there's a very, very wide boundary for how much randomness there can be while still having a lot of skill.
Maybe a way to think of it. So when we think about randomness, you might consider a normal curve. Everyone's seen this curve. It's basically a
bell curve.
A bell curve, yeah. A bell curve. A normal curve. It's very well defined mathematically. You don't need to understand that to get the importance of it. You have kind of a peak, which is the most likely thing to happen, and then it has a width, which is a standard deviation. Basically, how much, on average, the outcome will veer from the average, right? So, in my mind, increasing that standard deviation, kind of flattening out that probability curve, doesn't really have anything to do with a discussion about skill. So, as Orion said, the outcome is less deterministic as you flatten that probability curve. But the amount of skill required is an kind of independent thing.
I don't think so.
And poker's a great example because it has an extremely wide distribution. But I think people agree that poker is all skill.
It's not all skill.
Well, sorry. Sorry.
It's a big amount.
That's the wrong way to say it. It's a big amount, yeah.
I'm saying there's a wide amount of randomness that games can basically endure while still having a lot of skill play a factor. Right? I'm saying that there's but that doesn't mean that the trade-off doesn't exist. It just means that it isn't, in many cases in a well-designed game, it's not super meaningful to the experience, which is why we can have great games that do value skill and create super interesting puzzles and things to ponder with a lot of randomness involved. So I think we agree on this. Just coming at it from different angles.
Yeah, I think our mindsets in thinking about randomness are more different than I would have guessed prior to the discussion.
It is interesting how we come in, like, everything we've talked about, especially you and I, Matt, in preparing for this and discussing these things. This has been the most, like, conflict we've had so far in terms of how we're perceiving things in our ideas. I find it super interesting.
Yeah, it is.
But that's basically all I wanted to say in terms of input-output randomness.
We really didn't talk about input and output randomness.
We talked about it a bit. We tangented. So if you have anything else you want to say on it, but I mean, we could do an entire episode on that. Maybe we will someday, but it's something to always think about in terms of evaluating.
We kind of touched on this, but like input randomness we associate with Euros. And I think output randomness in the same way we associate with the Ameritrash games, right?
Oh, I would completely agree.
You think about the classics, like Risk is
one of the most frustrating examples of output randomness done poorly.
Yeah. And so I think, as is the case in a lot of these discussions, in this golden age of board gaming that we find ourselves in, where Euros and Ameritrash are mixing and it's beautiful.
Interbreeding. Frolicking in the fields of fun.
Yeah, it's just impassioned board game creation. yeah, these things are combined, and I don't have anything more to say about it.
Yeah, and in terms of like the amount of randomness you have in the game, I think the real determinant for how much enjoyment you get out of the game, there's a lot of factors that are involved there, but it comes down more to, I think, the perception of having control.
Yeah.
Rather than kind of a strict, if you were to chart mathematically the amount of randomness or the, how flat that bell curve is.
Huh. Yeah.
Which is an interesting point, which we'll get to more, I think, when we talk about chaos later on, foreshadowing. But let's...
And I think there's like two things that go into that. One is the bounded randomness that we talked about of having bounded outcomes, basically, so that you can... I don't know, so that you have, there's some limits on what can happen, and you can make some estimates of, or you can have an expectation of what will happen if you did it 1,000,000 times. And then the other thing is that games are all about interesting decisions, and I think we can agree that there are interesting decisions in chess, and there are interesting decisions in poker, and there are interesting decisions all throughout the middle.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a good game. Or I will say a good game can be anywhere on that spectrum of amount of randomness and still have interesting decisions if it's done well.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So I guess the conclusion is that randomness is really on how you implement it within the kind of the mechanical structure or the thematic structure of the game. More so than just pure quantity or amount of randomness.
Yeah, maybe let's talk about Risk a tiny bit more.
Sure.
Risk, is it fair to say it's all output randomness? I mean, there's really no randomness in the situations that you're presented with.
I cannot think of any bit of
I guess the cards that you draw one card per turn, and then you can eventually turn them in for bonuses.
Right, but there's no decision to be made there. That's all output. Like, as soon as you get a set, you're going to turn it in.
Yeah,
There's no real decision there.
Well, it might affect which regions you're going to pursue or something like that, but that's a really tiny amount.
Yeah.
Compared to the entire game is saying, I'm going to attack that thing, and then rolling die over and over and over again to see how many troops you lose.
Yeah. But we have games, again, like Twilight Imperium, that have similar battle resolution things, but
yeah, so
you feel like, and you do have a whole lot more control over the parameters of that battle.
Right.
And the process of getting to the battle is the most fun part of the game. The battle itself, the game isn't hinged on the battles being fun. The rest of the game is really the meat of it.
Those battles are the climax, the payoff for so much positioning and politicking at the table.
You could compare Twilight Imperium to Axis and Allies, which has essentially the same battle resolution system and the same random way of using dice to determine outcomes of the conflicts, but they feel totally separate to play.
Oh, yeah.
And there are other reasons for that,
and I haven't actually played Axis and Allies, but the way that it presents you with decisions is basically the same way that Risk does, right? Like, you have a bunch of regions on the board with units on them, and then you point to one and say, I attack it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing with Axis and Allies is
kind of upgrades. The kind of upgrades from Risk is that you have a certain amount of income and you choose to spend it on some collection of units that have different strengths.
Yeah,
different situations.
Right.
So there's decision making there, and then the other thing with Axis and Allies to a team, and there's very much an us versus them. Axis versus Allies. It's in the name.
There's also no catch-up mechanisms in Axis and Allies.
Yeah. So it is...
Or is there?
Well, not strictly speaking. the balancing factor that I've found is kind of supply line, because you mostly can deploy units in your home regions, and it takes time to get them out to the front.
Yeah, that's not much though.
So
Once
I've
you
gotten
capture,
situations. Most recently, I played Germany and was pushing into. No. It's not much compared to other things for sure. But that's more of a modeling the difficulty of invading another country. Very, more so than a catch-up mechanic.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we don't have a ton of games with that level of output randomness. I'm looking at Descent or Imperial Assault, and those are games you kind of have to go in knowing there's a lot of it, and they're probably actually closer to feeling like Risk than Twilight Imperium in terms of how much the dice rolling affects the game.
Yeah,
but you still
make,
make so many more interesting decisions.
Right. And I guess it's important, like what percentage of the game is actually resolving those output things. In Risk, it's like 3/4 of the game, or
pretty much
more, maybe. Which is why it doesn't feel great.
Yeah,
especially after you've played any other game. In Imperial Assault, there's just a lot more going on. So it's maybe like 25% of the game or 20% of the game.
Yeah, and you can do more to affect, again, and rebind kind of the random parameters there.
Yeah.
Which I guess segues pretty nicely into the next topic, which is bounded randomness, which we talked about a bit, and then white and pink noise, which is something I originally heard, again, from Jeff Engelstein in a great talk that's somewhere online where he talks about different types of noise and different types of randomness, which is, it originally comes from computer science or physics?
More electrical engineering. Orion, what would it be? I mean, it's like physics. Physics, really. Sure. Really just physics.
All science is ultimately physics, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so white noise is just randomness with an even distribution. You know, in physics, even distribution across all frequencies.
Yeah, so a typical die would be white noise.
Yeah, you roll a 6-sided die. If you roll it 1,000 times, you'll get this roughly the same number of each of the 6 numbers. Pink noise is randomness in proportion to the power. So in physics, as frequency increases, the kind of amount of energy in that wave or whatever, the amount of energy increases, so the amplitude we decrease. So you end up with this nice exponential curve, more or less. So anyway, all that to say, in games,
you can do all kinds of interesting things in terms of changing the random parameters. So again, going back to like Descent or Imperial Assault, stronger characters will be rolling different quantities and different types of dice based on the strength of that character, which will still be a random outcome, but will be slightly stronger compared to a weaker character.
Okay, you should probably scrap everything I said about pink noise, because I don't think it maps 1-to-1 to board games at all. So with pink noise, you're basically saying it's a random distribution, but you designed into the experience is a nonlinear distribution, basically.
Sure. Yeah.
So
just as an aside, kind of maybe not related to this, but I was reading in a book recently, and they were saying how the frequency of earthquakes and the magnitude of earthquakes, if you plot them on the Richter scale, is basically a perfect, almost exactly straight line. And so over time, you can predict the number of earthquakes that will happen of a certain magnitude just based on the magnitude. So based on that, you could say we expect a 7.0 earthquake every 5 years in San Francisco or something like that, based
Yeah.
on historical frequency of small earthquakes. And you can just draw this power line down and predict rare events, or not predict when they will happen, but predict the overall frequency of them
Yeah.
based on the frequency of much more common lower magnitude events.
That's true pink noise, I think, because the low magnitude ones you expect to have happen way more than that super rare but extreme earthquake. And that's basically what pink noise is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in terms of that, I'm not sure I can think of any board game instances of actual pink noise. Or actually, an example would be in D&D, like the crit. The crit is kind of the extreme event that happens much rare, and then you have kind of moderate successes that happen more often.
Correct. And there are also games, or at least there are dice that have been created that play with the distribution of numbers.
Yeah.
So I know there's a set, you can easily create kind of a few, I can't remember how many, but a few different types of D6s that have the same average but different standard deviations.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think that kind of thing games should utilize more.
Absolutely.
Like,
it's
interesting.
It's really crazy to think that we pretty much use even distribution die.
And we make bell curves just by like giving them multiple dice.
Yeah.
Which
is fair.
Which is fine. And it keeps a kind of a normal distribution, but like games, there's so much space there to deal with distributions that aren't normal.
One example, the examples I can think are more with custom dice. So like Armada, Star Wars Armada,
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, you might roll the red dice, which have, well, I don't really know the distributions, but might have like a better chance of hitting, but you know, don't hit as hard or something like that.
Yeah. There's a bit of that in Armada for sure. Yeah. I guess that's the only place you really see it that I've seen, at least, is in custom dice and Fantasy Flight games.
Yeah.
But it's something I think is really cool to look into in terms of design, especially with dice.
Because you're crafting a particular.
Don't you also have it in like a deck builder or something, or when you're drawing modifiers from a deck, where the most common thing is like a +1, but there's like 1 +3 or 1 crit in the deck.
Yeah, like Gloomhaven.
So drawing from a deck is kind of different in fundamental ways, but yeah, I think Gloomhaven is the perfect example, where you start with kind of a white noise deck that modifies your attacks. And then
relatively white noise.
Relatively white noise. You know, there's some -2s, +2s, -1s, +1s. But then as you progress your character, you can influence the makeup of that deck in very different ways.
Yeah. Pandemic is kind of an example of this once you're in the game, because you will have, typically how the game plays out is you have on the top of the whatever the deck is called there, you'll have a set of cards where a number of them will be more or less fine, still negative, but fine consequences, and then a couple, maybe 1 or 2, will be really catastrophic. Which, you know, gets to my criticism of Pandemic in the end game, but in the mid game, it's really compelling.
Yeah. I mean, when they were designing Pandemic, I think that it's kind of interesting. Like, they obviously put a lot of thought into how you shuffle the deck. And it's kind of a lot of work up front to, you know, divide the deck into 5 piles, shuffle 1 epidemic card into each of the 5 piles. But you can tell, like, there's a randomness there, but it's a very carefully crafted randomness that gives kind of an average experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Ryan, are you basically getting off the train real soon, or?
My stop is supposed to be in 9 minutes.
Okay.
So I think I can probably get off and keep talking, but I'll need, to get off.
Okay. Let's move on from that and go to this idea of chaos, which is where
Whoa.
a lot of the pre-podcast debating was centered around, because we're talking about chaos where Matt's talking about kind of the idea of chaotic things in physics mostly. Is that kind of the...
No, it's the math idea of chaos theory.
Okay,
where
so mathematical.
All variations in input makes large variations in output.
Yeah.
To the point of the system being almost impossible to model, because you can't get enough significant digits on your inputs to be able to properly calculate out and extrapolate out and process the prediction, the forecast going forward.
Where were you in our pre-discussion to lay the smackdown on Mark, Ryan?
Yeah, that was way clearer than like 45 minutes of talking to Matt about
I just got less and less clear as you guys got more and more ridiculous in your rejections.
I love the idea of chaos theory. It's
yeah, it's
cool.
super interesting. It's super interesting. I think it's more interesting than it is relevant to board gaming, but...
Yeah, it's also conjures up scenes from Jurassic Park, which is an excellent movie. But also, I think the example I was reading about it most recently is in weather prediction, where they used to think like, oh, we should be able to predict the weather once we can, model the humidity and, whatever other variables, for example. But they would run the same system, and beyond like a week, it's actually negative correlation of their predictions to the outputs, because the tiniest changes in initial conditions, by the time you get that far out in that complex of a system, has these exponential effects on the output. So that's why we get things like, the butterfly effect of, a tiny perturbation of the atmosphere 1,000 miles away causes a tornado or a hurricane over here. But you can't actually draw that cause-effect line because there's so much noise and data and everything else going on.
So the way that I've been describing it is it's it's an emergent randomness from a system that's well defined. We can measure the humidity, we can measure the temperature, and we have a rough idea of how those interact. So, the preconditions aren't a mystery, the interactions aren't a mystery, but the sensitivity of the system to variations is such that a randomness emerges from basically a non-random situation.
Right, based on just the granularity of your...
So Orion, I have one example basically that I think is...
We came up with two.
Moderately interesting. Do you have any examples in board gaming that you came up with of situations that are chaotic? Did we lose him?
Not yet. You there, Al?
Yeah, Joshua said it well. This was way earlier, but the longer the game, the statistics start to balance out. That's a good way of saying it.
Well, he hasn't officially dropped.
Oh, I think I might be back.
There you are.
I lost you for a bit.
There you are. Yep.
So did you have any examples of chaotic systems in board gaming?
I feel like board games don't have the sort of extremely fine granularity that causes a massive output.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think you're right.
Like most board games, like the most granular initial condition is like the makeup of the deck, but even so, it's generally balanced so that outcomes are roughly within a bounded range.
Yeah. So, which example should
Like, you don't have hurricanes show up in board games, right?
we? Yeah.
Like,
Right. And I think you're.
Use the analogy. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I keep talking over you. I think you're right, and I think this is one type of randomness that you're only ever going to get an approximation of in a tabletop game. So, I mean, we came up with a couple examples. You came up with diplomacy, which has, up to 7 players making simultaneous decisions that then all resolve at once. I think that's similar to the example that I've been giving, which is Dungeon Lords, where there's this action programming mechanic where
they're essentially the same. They're extremely similar mechanisms.
I think it plays out differently. There's nothing. Well,
they're both simultaneous reveal programming.
Yes, but I don't think diplomacy is as chaotic a system, because diplomacy, all the interactions are local.
The reason I drew the parallel is because, and this is something we kind of talked about and resolved before, but the effect on the game state or the effect on, say, the odds of different people winning the game can be much more dramatically affected by small miscalculations in diplomacy, whereas Dungeon Lords has more ability to kind of catch up from bad calculations.
Yeah. Okay, so let me describe the Dungeon Lord situation. So in Dungeon Lords, everyone is going to choose 3 actions to do out of 8. And each of those 8 actions has kind of different versions of the same, and which version of the action you get is determined by the order that you reveal that action. So everyone programs 1, 2, 3 actions, and once they're all programmed, you reveal in turn around the table everyone's first action, second action, third action, putting pieces in the respective slots on those 8 actions on the board. So where the system, I think, exhibits chaos is that the known information that I have is what I want to do, what I think everyone else wants to do, and what I think everyone else thinks everyone else wants to do. So there's kind of that game theory situation where we're all kind of balancing what everyone wants to do against each other. And then we're trying to jockey for position on these various, the 8 action tracks. But when we program our actions in, then it's all programmed and then it all resolves together. And kind of out of that comes results that are very affected by small miscalculations. So the point is, it's not a system that you could possibly fully understand. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out what I should say in response, since we've hashed a lot of this out. I guess I don't see it as a chaotic system. And I think Orion's right. Like, the granularity isn't there necessarily. I think maybe the language to describe this kind of thing is more along the lines of high variance decisions or high leverage decisions? Because your
No, because
criticism...
that's something different. And don't think of it as criticism, because my enjoyment of Dungeon Lords really isn't relevant. I think it's interesting.
I just don't see how it differs that much from other types of decisions where things are affected by the other players in the game.
Can you think of another game that has a situation of simultaneous decision where fine details of the output matter in a way where your decision is dependent on every other decision and vice versa?
I mean, any game with simultaneous play. Libertalia would be a more extreme example, probably.
Oh,
Blood Rage and Rising Sun.
Yeah. Well, some aspects of Blood Rage, but Rising Sun more so.
Rising, yeah. I just mean the combat. But,
sure, yeah. I mean, Comet is a 2-player example of that, kind of. It's a simultaneous kind of auction reveal in the combat.
It's not about not being able to understand someone else's position going into the decision. It's about small variations in decisions made having bigger impacts on the outputs. So in Dungeon Lords, the point is you get a different version of the action based on the way that this system plays out.
Sure.
I mean, in something like Comet, it's just a matter of whether or not you win or not. That's rock, paper, scissors. That's not chaotic.
Well, no, but there's like 3 different axes it's measured on in Comet. I mean, in Libertalia,
sure, but it's
Libertalia might be the more
Libertalia might be,
because that
yes.
can start like these weird chain reactions. In
Right.
Dungeon Lords, it's often like you get to do 2 units of the thing instead of 3
it's been a
units
long
of the
time since
thing.
I've played Libertalia. I think that is the better example.
Libertalia, I think,
And-
especially with high player counts.
Yeah, right.
2 or 3 player Libertalia is more constrained.
Right, because if you try to go into it to get a certain result, you're just going to be disappointed, because it's not that you can't try to understand what other people are doing. It's that it's not worth it. I mean,
in Libertalia, for
Right.
people who enjoy the game, the fun of the game is trying to outguess everyone else. Because it's similar to Dungeon Lords in that from the beginning of the game,
none
you
of
know
this...
exactly what everyone else has in hand. Mm-hmm. And then it's moderately easy to track what everyone has as they play.
And none of these, like I said, none of these are perfect examples of chaotic systems. I think the idea of chaos is far more interesting than as it pertains to board gaming.
Yeah.
I think with Libertalia, that's probably a better example at a high player count. So, I don't know. My opinion is that systems that kind of exhibit that well, my opinion is that games that kind of have this chaotic systems are really presenting the players with I guess decisions that are less meaningful than they should be. I don't know. In my sense, I guess what I'm saying is chaos in board games is generally a design deficiency.
What about Space Alert? I mean, Space Alert basically is a cooperative game about trying to make sense of that kind of chaotic system, right? The hurdle in the game is overcoming it, which is an interesting twist, a bit.
Yeah, I don't know that I would call that really a chaotic system. I mean, it's I guess you could say it approximates that in that, if you mess up one movement, then
it can have far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, but it's not really about that because the consequences are kind of static. Like if you forgot to move to the blue side, then you're just one side too close to the red for the entire game. But you're not, your output randomness isn't going on a completely unexpected track. It's just off by one.
Right, but being off by one is often critically important.
Absolutely, but it's not chaos.
So I don't see. I mean, by that definition, I don't see how any of your other examples are chaotic
colloquially,
either.
it's chaos. I don't know. I think it's pretty clear, but I'm clearly not.
I think I have just a really big brain block on this one.
I said we shouldn't talk about it. You brought it up.
I think it's interesting. Joshua comments, Robo Rally. Is that?
I think Robo Rally is probably the same thing as Space Alert. Maybe a little more, because you're programming against someone else who's also programming.
Right.
But what really starts to, I think, create a chaotic system in something like Libertalia is that you have so many agents. You know, and that's a feature of real world chaos, right? Like predicting the weather.
Mm-hmm.
There are quadrillions of molecules in the atmosphere. You can approximate that all, but it's kind of the sum of all of these random interactions from which the macro randomness comes.
Well, I think a lot of the examples we give are, create situations that are clearly trying to rein that in. So, like, knowing Libertalia, if everyone got completely random cards, would be far more chaotic than the kind of perfect information game it is. Or am I still missing the point on this?
I don't know. I don't know that it would make any difference.
Interesting. Huh. I have a feeling we're going to be continuing to talk about this off podcast some more, because I'm honestly really intrigued by this point. Well, let's move on to something else in the subject of randomness.
I just hope that anytime we say chaos, you just put some really sick reverb for the final.
Like a guitar riff.
Just like chaos.
The next thing I had... Let's skip that one. I don't care about cognitive biases. Unless you guys really wanted to talk about it. Doesn't sound like it. Let's talk about some games with some particularly interesting forms of randomness or interesting random systems. I had a list here. I don't know if you guys prepped any. Oh, there goes Orion.
I prepped so much.
Oh yeah, you had a couple. We talked about Gloomhaven already, that you're able to kind of modify as you progress as a character the random attack deck that modifies your attacks. That's a really cool system that I like a lot. Twilight Struggle, I think, has
with the Gloomhaven system. I think it illustrates something else in that when you have something that generates a random distribution, the kind of the feeling of randomness is mitigated over time. So when you spend 15 games with your character, kind of the quality of your deck you know, comes out, and it's less random overall. So when you're making these changes to push your deck to be more positive or less negative, and those are both viable strategies, it gives you a really cool control over the randomness over time.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting because it kind of plays with the perception of randomness in an interesting way.
Yeah. I also marked down Twilight Struggle in that a big part of the strategy of Twilight Struggle is contending with the deck reshuffle. And we talked, there's a little bit about this, I guess, in high-level deck building play, in deck builder games, on manipulating the reshuffling. But in Twilight Struggle, it's super important because there are essentially only going to be 2 deck reshuffles in the game, and it's a big early war strategy to bury cards right after the first reshuffle, bury significant cards for your opponent, so that you basically don't see them again for the next half of the game. And then also tracking important cards like scoring cards as they move through the draw and discard decks. And it's something you don't see a whole lot in other games, but it's a key component in Twilight Struggle of factoring in that random element and making it a big part of strategy.
Yeah.
Just super. I love it.
Yeah. You get a similar kind of reshuffle management in Dominion.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying with deck building. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is cool. Tragedy Looper is an interesting example because it's a game where there's not randomness by my definition, but there's a whole lot of trying to predict what the other players are doing. So it's asymmetric. You have essentially a kind of a game master who is trying to get away with a crime, and there's a whole bunch of deductive elements that the other players are trying to figure out by kind of testing certain actions and seeing the results. So kind of a clue-like deduction thing, but much more complicated. And the DM, or what I'm calling the DM or the GM, I don't think that's actually the title prescribed in the game, but the person who is trying to manipulate the other players has to do a lot of work in thinking through not only kind of the strict deductive capability of a setup, but thinking through how the other players are going to react to whatever setup you create, or what modifiers you put on the next scene or the next redo, because you're kind of going through the same timeline multiple times.
Right.
And you're able to change little bits and pieces of that timeline each time you reset it, and the other players are getting more information. It's a lot of really interesting uncertainty in terms of predicting what other players will do, and also limiting the possibility space of what they're able to discover.
Yeah, so from the player's perspective, it kind of appears as random.
It's just a giant system of black boxes.
Right.
So you go in and you do a certain thing on this character, and you get an output. Yeah. And you use that output over time, all those outputs, to paint a picture that the game master knows about.
You could imagine like an app that plays the role of the game master. Mm-hmm. And then you might say that it is random.
Depending on how that AI is set up, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting perspective thing.
Yeah, interesting game system. Time of Crisis, I wrote down, just because it kind of flips where you would expect the random elements to be. So it's a deck builder in which you don't draw your cards randomly off your deck. You actually choose what your hand of cards is going to be each turn. In some sense, makes it a much more kind of intense strategic deck building experience because you have that extra layer of decision making. But then it throws in these kind of foreign invaders that can come in on the board, and that's a highly randomized system of dice rolls to determine that, which can significantly change the game. I think it works there, but I find that one interesting because that's not where my design instincts would have led me in constructing that game, I think.
I cannot for the life of me remember anything except the deck.
You have the barbarians on the outside, and each turn you roll a die to determine
yes.
which section is activated, and then you do another roll to see if they invade that turn, and if so, with how many units.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Which is highly variable in like kind of a white noise thing. But
yeah.
Yeah, that's just more of a curiosity. Pulsar
like
2849 we've talked about before, just a brilliant example of input randomness.
Yeah, for
where
sure.
It's a dice drafting thing, but the dice draft is weighted with certain parameters and kind of incentives built into the system of just selecting the dice that you're going to use to choose actions later.
It's really a great illustration of how a really thick Euro can just be made so interesting by injecting randomness in certain place. Because other than the dice drafting, it is a heavy Euro with
medium.
Last podcast I was calling things a light Euro.
Yeah.
Nah, they're medium. Okay, everything's a medium Euro.
Most Euros we have are medium Euros. It's not
on that normal
distribution. It's more of a normal.
Yeah, but it's a Euro through and through with very actions that are very kind of deterministic. So
yeah, there's a little bit of output randomness on when you're exploring planets.
Right. Yes.
But
so
that's not super significant.
The brilliance of the dice drafting at the beginning of the round, which we've seen some crazy random. If you get a dice roll where you have a bunch of 1s and 2s, when you really wanted a 5.
Oh yeah, the 5 becomes super punishing to take.
Super punishing to take, but it might be worth it, and you're kind of. Yeah.
I think the brilliance of that system is that it's really interesting and engaging and feels fair regardless of what the actual dice values are.
Yeah, well said.
That's super cool. 5 Tribes is an interesting example because you're effectively part of the game is manipulating the input randomness of the player whose turn is next, because it's all played out on this central board, and your turn will change the starting parameters for the next person's decision making, which I suppose you see that kind of thing a lot in many games, but not to that extent. So like in Castles of Burgundy, you draft a tile, everyone else doesn't have access to that tile, but part of what makes 5 Tribes interesting and also can make it drag on a lot is that you change the game state significantly and the board state significantly before each player's turn.
Yeah.
The person before manipulates it a lot.
Yeah. It's kind of random in a macro sense, but when you get down to actually playing it, you just can't look ahead more than one round.
Oh, sure, yeah.
As far as the decisions that you're presented with, you're kind of presented with a board on your turn. You decide what to do. And then the next person does it, and you just can't look too far ahead.
Yeah, but
Which-
but when it is your turn, though, part of your decision making, at least in decent play of Five Tribes, is making sure you're not setting up a killer turn for the next person.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is it's not really a matter of randomness.
Not really. I mean, it's just the input is the board state you're presented with is just completely different than it was the previous turn because of the player decisions. And then, of course, I've got to bring up Netrunner, which has one of the coolest kind of super random elements that I've seen in any game, in a highly strategic game, and that's the Psy game element, which is essentially a modified rock, paper, scissors, but it's modified in such cool ways. Where in a Psy game, usually what'll happen is that both players will secretly do a simultaneous bid of 0, 1, or 2 credits, which is your currency in the game. And typically the corporation wants the values to be different, and the runner wants the values to be the same. I think I got that right. It might be... It's been months since I played Netrunner, and now I'm doubting myself, and it's late at night. But one side wants them to be different, and one side wants them to be the same. So, in some sense, it's a rock, paper, scissors thing, where instead of a 50-50 odds, it's 2/3 and 1/3 odds. But since you're bidding your credits, there's an entire new layer of psychological decision-making in, okay, are they going to be willing to spend 2 credits here to try to get through this server or avoid this trap? Sometimes as a corporation, you set up game traps just to tax the runner, and going in you're always going to bid 0, and then they have to bid 1 to get through it. And sometimes you're really looking at the state of the game and trying to figure out the kind of decision making that the other person's going to be employing it, and try to weigh this particular instance against their economic state in the game. And it's just so cool. I'll pour one out for Netrunner. I guess it's not dead yet. Worlds is coming up. It's going to die in like a month or 2. I still need to get the last pack. Were there any games that you wanted to highlight in terms of interesting random facets?
Give me a sec. Worth noting 4X, the game that just has 0 randomness. No input randomness, no output randomness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we covered just about everything. Yeah. Games implement randomness in different ways. Sometimes it's a big deck of random encounter type of things. Sometimes it's rolling dice. Dice Forge is interesting because it's a game where you're rolling the same dice a bunch of times, but you have some control over those faces.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because it kind of feels strange to pay resources to change just something that's going to only be relevant 1/6 of the time. But you roll the die so many times that it becomes relevant.
You roll the dice a ton in that game.
Way more than
you would think
like
a 45-minute game. Yeah. Which it has to be that way for the game to function.
Yeah. But that's a cool, that's another cool thing where you just have these 2 dice that you're rolling, but it's the averaging out over many. Well, I cannot think of wording at all right now. It's the averaging out over time that basically makes it interesting.
Yeah. Joshua in the chat, in addition to shouting no, I think at some point during our chaos discussion, Sorry, I was really using all my brain power to not read the chat and instead try to think through things that seem like they're partitioned in my mind as a barrier. Mentions Aeon's End, which I haven't played, but apparently is a deck builder kind of game where you choose the order in which you discard your cards, and then you don't shuffle the deck. You just flip over the discard pile, which is really cool. I can't think of any other game that does that.
You're doing a deck builder episode.
In
the
pretty
near
soon.
Future, right? Yeah.
I think that's one of the games we'll probably be talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think we could really get into the detailed decisions that you have to make in a game like Dominion. I think that the randomness in the Dominion deck is incredibly interesting, but those are kind of details that are...
Yeah, we'll get to that in a future podcast.
Yeah.
All right, I think we have kind of exhausted a very shallow overview at randomness. Honestly, I'm inspired now to list a couple topics we could do future podcasts on, just kind of inspired by this discussion.
Yeah.
I think it'd be really cool. So this might be a starting point to kind of a deeper look into...
I hope you can salvage a coherent conversation out of what we just had.
I will be able to salvage a conversation. I can promise you that much out of editing this thing. Thanks for listening, everybody. Unfortunately, Ryan dropped out. He was on a train and now is... where was he going? Vancouver or something?
Vancouver.
Yeah, he's in Canada now.
I don't think they have the internet in Canada.
Oh, is it really? They're living on the dark ages there, huh?
That's why I assume he drops off.
As soon as he crossed the border, it just shuts off. Thanks for listening, everybody. Check out the thoughtfulgamer.com for all kinds of cool reviews and writings and discussions and generally good stuff. Man, that was a rigging endorsement I just gave myself.
If you've made it through this
it's
this
like
behemoth,
12:30 in the morning.
It's early.
Yeah.
The Dunkin' has worn off. They
the
didn't
coffee.
have Boston cream donuts. So if you've made it this far,
I mean, you made it this far without your Boston cream donut, but check me out on social media, on Twitter and on Facebook. Don't forget to rate and review this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you would like to watch our recordings live, chime in and discuss things with us as we ramble on about obtuse topics, go to patreon.com/thethoughtfulgamer. We appreciate any and all support that you all out there in the internet world can provide. Goodbye, everybody.
good night. Good night, Josh.
Thanks for listening, Josh.
Oh, man.
I guess the later when we get the West Coast crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah, my brain is
Fried.
reached capacity. I think it'll be a really good one, though. I liked it.
The lateness, in addition to trying to talk about chaos, was just...
I think our discussion on it earlier was better, but I think our discussion on it in the recording is better for the podcast.
Okay. I will trust you.
I don't know. I'll throw it in there. It was a small part, honestly. We spent more time on other topics.
Yeah.
It'll be good. All right, I'm shutting off the stream. Good night.